PodCastle, episode 791 for Tuesday the 13th of June 2023.
Hello everyone, and welcome to PodCastle. I'm Aidan Doyle, one of PodCastle's associate editors. I'm an Australian writer and editor, and the author of The Writer's Book of Doubt, an illustrated book of essays on how to deal with doubt and motivation for writers. In 2016, Graham and Rachel invited me to be part of the PodCastle team. I've had a wonderful 7 years serving as an associate editor. It's been a joy encountering such a great range of stories that writers have sent to us over the years. PodCastle has gone from strength to strength during that time and been nominated and won a bunch of international awards. I've had the privilege to work with a group of talented editors, readers, producers and writers. But alas, it's now time for me to move on, and I'm finishing my time on the PodCastle staff. I got married earlier this year, and I'm starting a new chapter of my life. Today's episode is a lovely bittersweet story about letting things go. PodCastle is proud to present Fine Flying Things by Adele Gardner. The story was originally published in the anthology Twisted Cat Tales, edited by Esther Schrader. It previously appeared in PodCastle episode 260 in 2013. Adele Gardner is a fiction writer and award-winning poet with a poetry collection, Halloween Hearts, from Jackanape Press, and over 475 stories, poems, art and articles in Analog Science Fiction and Fact, Clark's World, Strange Horizons, PodCastle, Daily Science Fiction and more. A pro member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, Horror Writers Association, a life member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, and the Poetry Society of Virginia, and a graduate of the Clarion West Writers Workshop, this gender-fluid pan-night owl loves libraries, samurai films, and reading comics with cats. Adele serves as literary executor for father, mentor, and namesake Delbert R. Gardner, as co-chair of the 2022 Dwarf Star Awards. Learn more at www.gardnercastle.com. Your reader today is Ellie Hirschman, a self-described former aspiring voice actor who has worked with Darker Projects and Dream Realm Productions, is also involved in Cool Fool Productions, turning bad audio scripts into intentionally bad comedy gold. His professional voice work ranges from children's educational material to real estate advice website audio, with a scientific article and a guided tour of a Polish salt mine thrown in for good measure. In his free time, Ellie enjoys cartooning, listening to old-time radio drama, and referring to himself in the third person. Enjoy the story.
Fine Flying Things by Adele Gardner. Frankie watched open-mouthed as the cats soared up into the sky. All he could think of was Dolly's photograph, that crazy one where the cat flew across a stream of water while Dolly perched on a chair. He ran outside. In that little space of time, yet more cats had lifted off from Earth. They floated like furry balloons, orange and gray and tiger-striped. Some looked scared, their claws extended to full panic, like a kitten caught in a tree. But there was nothing to grasp in the sky. The clouds didn't seem to slow them down. Others looked mildly interested, their whiskers drooping in curious contentment. Still others seemed entranced with possibilities, stretching their claws to snag unwary birds as they soared by. Frankie gaped at the spectacle of cats dotting the sky like a flock of migrating birds. As the felines swarmed through the air, he glimpsed a familiar gray leg. By instinct, he reached up to grab the striped appendage, just as he might have done to spare the china. The skinny leg jerked taut, and he found himself looking up into the startled blue eyes of his Maurice. Maurice gazed back down at him with a plaintive mew. He looked startled and forlorn, as he had as a kitten when Frankie first caught him, a frightened, feral kitten crouched in the backyard. Maurice's call set off a series of answering mews like a flock of birds calling raucously across the sky. "Maurice! What are you doing up there?" Frankie felt bewildered and even a little shocked. He did not like to admit this to his cat, of course. He did not want Maurice to think he was passing judgment on his strange new avian affinity. Then Frankie felt a sudden shift inside. He was growing lighter. It was that odd sensation of weightlessness in his middle that he got in a fast elevator. He wasn't sure his shoes left the ground, though he thought his feet rose inside them. It shocked him badly. He almost let go. As the gray-striped fur began to slide through his fingers, Frankie gave a little yelp and clamped down hard. Maurice mewed in pain or fear, and the sound bounced among the other cats, odd-shaped kites rising distant in the dusk. Frankie dragged Maurice back down into his arms. "What's gotten into you?" Maurice looked up at him with that intense, lost look he'd had as a kitten. Mournful. A kind of helpless confusion. Frankie had sometimes wondered if Maurice missed living outside, or remembered his stray mother. But Maurice was devoted to Frankie, and he rarely ventured out except into the garden, where Frankie knew he could trust him not to run away. Among the roses and azaleas, the nasturtiums and morning glories, Maurice would crouch under the garden bench and peer out at the butterflies and birds. If they got too close, he would flatten himself to the ground. Now Maurice huddled in Frankie's arms, an odd and ruffled sight, as even his fur seemed to want to fly away. Maurice gazed up at the man who had become his mother with a plaintive look of indignation. Frankie thought he knew what Maurice meant. Things weren't supposed to be this way. "What's going on, buddy?" Frankie asked him, gazing around with trepidation as his next-door neighbor's fat orange tabby drifted up over the rose bushes. He hovered there for a moment with a look of comical surprise. As a sparrow darted past, that look changed to one of greedy joy, and the fat orange tom floated industriously away. Maurice yowled a sad farewell. "Let's go inside," Frankie said hastily. He'd seen enough. It looked like the end of the world, with cats for clouds, and he didn't want Maurice getting any ideas. Maurice growled as Frankie closed the door. He was probably out of sorts with all the strangeness. With the glass safely closed and his now light cat clutched tight in his arms, Frankie stared out at the expanse of sky above the suburban roofs and fenced-in yards. Cats danced above the spikes of the wooden fences in an entirely different way. "What's the world coming to?" Frankie mumbled. He felt strangely dislocated, as if his heart was lifting off along with those strange balloons, light with wonder and fear. Maurice struggled in his arms, writhing and twisting like an eel, with an energy he'd seldom shown since he'd become tame. Frankie released him. Maurice went drifting straight for the ceiling, a look of purpose on his face, whiskers alert. Frankie devised a series of perches, setting bowls of food and water on top of counters and refrigerator. But now that he could fly, would Maurice still want to eat the same heavy food? Perhaps he'd prefer birdseed instead. But the thought of running out to purchase it under that cat-dark sky filled Frankie with trepidation. Maurice, with a sleek running motion, flew to the large glass doors. He pressed close and began chirping with the same agitation he'd once shown for birds. Frankie stood beside Maurice, staring out the window. More and more cats were rising from the fields, from the fences. They bumped into one another gently and drifted off onto different trajectories. Maurice mewed softly, a cat's whisper, but it sounded so forlorn, as if he knew something Frankie did not, as if he was watching all his friends fly off to a different destiny, leaving him behind. Together they watched the cats drift off into the dusk. They were getting higher and higher. Some of the first cats were only specks against the sunset. The next morning, Frankie woke to a world that felt oddly quiet. There was a strange charge in the air, as if static clung to everything. He felt so certain that he'd receive a jolt that he jumped when he touched the doorknob, though it was cool and inert in his hand. He walked around the house on tiptoe. What might be next? Would all the kitchen implements be floating about near the ceiling in a frenzy of clashing knives? Would the house tear itself free of its foundations? But there was only Maurice, poised in an arch on the counter, his toes barely touching the ground. He craned his neck into one of the bowls, moving slowly and carefully, as if any sudden movement might send him soaring into the air. Thoughtfully, Frankie reached under the counter and brought out the leash. Having lost a cat in the road when he was young, Frankie had vowed never to let another loose anywhere near traffic. He didn't want to risk the chance that Maurice might run away. The world was too dangerous. Frankie belted on the halter. Maurice had never seemed to mind. He usually walked ahead, pausing to chew grass or sniff hedges, sometimes leaving his mark, though he'd been neutered long ago. Frankie sometimes wondered if it was cruel to keep Maurice confined, but Maurice had always seemed happy enough, purring and rubbing against Frankie enthusiastically whenever he came home. Frankie carried Maurice cautiously outside and locked the door. He stood on the stoop looking up and down the tree-lined street. Everything seemed quiet. He didn't see any of the usual cats slinking across the sidewalks or running up and down the hedgerows. Gingerly, he set Maurice down and descended the stairs. Soon, Maurice floated along behind him, bobbing at the end of his tether. Frankie whistled and tried to look nonchalant, but Maurice made no secret of his interest. Eyes wide, whiskers flicking, Maurice uttered occasional mews and high-pitched chirps as they passed brick steps and wrought-iron fences, and the trees that shaded the walk from the road. Had all the cats flown away? As they rounded the block, they finally spotted a Persian in a window. The white cat pressed its flat face to the glass and howled, scratching the glass, hauling himself up the window by the narrow wooden crossbars. Frankie walked on hurriedly, but his arm was lifting now, and it wasn't his own light spirits. His hand waved high over his head, taut as the line he'd wrapped around his wrist. He could feel his feet lifting slightly from the ground. He looked up in alarm. Maurice was so high that there was slack in the harness beneath him, like the apex of a kite string. The halter cut into his fur as he swung close to the branches of the nearest tree. In his eagerness, Maurice uttered a low growl that reminded Frankie of a string of curses. Frankie retreated to the sidewalk, calling Maurice as he tugged on the leash, but Maurice was having one of his stubborn moments. He had grabbed a lower branch and clung tight. Frankie stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. He looked around quickly. No one was in sight, but he still felt like a fool. "Come down, Maurice, come out of there," he coaxed. "Don't you want to go home and get your treat?" The chubby gray tabby protested with a caterwaul. Frankie stared up at him distressed, and followed the taut line of Maurice up to another pair of eyes. The leaves rustled slightly. The eyes moved among green shadows. The shadowy body seemed to move in an odd way for a cat, clinging upside down like a possum. For a moment, confronted by an inverted grin and ears like jowls, Frankie wondered if it was an oversized bat. Then he recognized the Sphinx from down the street. Standing in the tree, not clinging by its claws, standing upside down, its feet pointed at the sky, the tree branches the only thing that stood between him and a long tumbling fall. Frankie gaped. Maurice tugged at the lead, and Frankie stumbled forward without resistance. Maurice burbled at the Sphinx. The Sphinx answered in kind with one long, crooning meow. Maurice looked back at Frankie, a plea in those blue eyes. Frankie felt decidedly odd under that gaze. He walked closer to the tree, peering upward. Maurice hovered, waiting, watching as his human friend drew close. One quiet meow. The kind Maurice uttered each night before going to sleep in the crook of Frankie's knees. The little chirp that had been a coda to each day, a bubble filled with the little joy of hearing his mother say, "I love you," before he went to sleep. Good night. There was no one else to say these words to Frankie now. Carefully, Frankie drew on the lead until Maurice hovered close, all four paws outspread as if to guide him in the air. Maurice was purring, still looking at him with those wide, eloquent eyes. Frankie held him close, despite the lightness that threatened to burst free from his chest, kissed the furry head and sighed, then unfastened the harness and stood back to let him go. "Goodbye," he whispered. "Good boy. Good Maurice. Goodbye. I love you." And Maurice, still purring, with that wide, loving gaze, paused to utter his little chirp before drifting high into the leaves. Frankie felt so odd, as though all the ties that tethered him to earth were snapping. Frankie wandered from room to room. He had always had so many hobbies it was hard to find time for them all, but now he could not think of a single thing he'd like to do. He picked up a book, then cast it aside. He sorted through his watercolors, then flipped through his address book past theaters and restaurants, all the things he liked to do alone. His only surviving relative was his sister, but it had been almost 50 years since she'd married overseas, and they had so little to say to one another that it was more depressing to call than to sit alone and to rummage through his memories. He sat in the living room watching the cloudy sky. Were those geese against the purple clouds? Only last evening the cats had risen like bubbles through champagne. He wondered where Maurice was now. Maybe Maurice would get hungry, come back and say hello. Frankie filled several bowls with Maurice's favorite foods and set them on the windowsills, then pulled up the glass and screens. As night descended, the old fear crept in again. He couldn't leave the windows open to the dark. He closed the windows and blinds on the first floor slowly, trying to argue against his fear. As he took the food away, he wondered if it was something the cats had eaten. He nibbled meditatively, looking out at the darkened streets where the lamps glowed in their cast-iron prisons. He watched the trees rustling in the night breeze, casting shifting shadows. He thought about his toes. Were they tingling? Didn't they feel the slightest bit lighter than air? He chewed and crunched, reached in for another mouthful, and found only crumbs. He looked at his hand in the bowl and sighed. He was only a man after all. Frankie climbed up to bed, closing the other windows, ending at last in his room. He paused before the open window, where the streetlight shone in strongly, giving a milky cast to the gloom. Perhaps Maurice would come back. They had slept together for over 10 years now. Cats always had to come back on their own time. He left the window open. He lay in bed, missing Maurice, trying to imagine that he felt his old friend's warmth behind his knees. His stomach hurt, but he didn't think it was the cat food. He fell asleep at last. A sound. Branches against brick? Someone calling his name? He woke up all at once. A cat's yowl beyond the window. There was no question of dreams. He knew that cry too well. He rushed to the window and thrust his head out into the chill night air. "Maurice?" he called, anxiety making it echo. An answering mew close in the darkness. He followed the sound. A pair of blue eyes glinted like tiny mirrors in the tree. The tree shook again. The rustling grew frantic for a moment, as though someone were trying desperately to hold on. That mew again, despairing now. For a moment Frankie closed his eyes. He knew this was no dream, but he prayed he'd have the courage to act as though it were. Maurice had come to him. Now it was up to him to bridge the gap. Holding tight to the windowsill, he stretched out, reaching for the nearest leaf. He pulled it in patiently until he felt the knob of the twig against the limb. Maurice called to him softly. Encouragement now. After 10 years, he could recognize the difference. He knew that he could trust Maurice. Knew it by the loving way Maurice would settle in each night, by the way Maurice always sensed his mood and came to cuddle and cheer him when he was depressed. Frankie drew a shuddering breath and sat on the edge of the open window. Then, holding the branch tightly in both hands, Frankie slid outside. For a moment it seemed the stars streaked past him, the street lamps and their myriad reflections. He could not tell up from down. Was he falling as the stars streaked past and the dark leapt up to cradle him? Then he felt a sharp prick on his shoulders, and he knew he was flying. He felt the cat's soft warmth along his neck, where Maurice loved to perch along his shoulders. His pajama shirt drew tight under his arms. He lifted towards a glow as bright as the moon, and then it was below him, just one more lamp in the darkness. The night air brushed his cheeks like feathers, and he lifted his head to see the moon. The clouds, blue-gray in thick layers, looked solid enough to stand upon. Below, the trees looked like garden greens, and the houses small as a model village. The church spire streaked silver by the moon. The roads looked like strange markings in the dirt, and the fences could not be seen at all. "Maurice?" he murmured, as the cat purred warm against his neck. Sometimes a striped gray tail would lash under his nose to make him sneeze. "Thank you for coming back for me." The cat purred louder as they soared past the city limits and out over the countryside. Frankie's checked pajamas flapped in the breeze. He lost a button to the continued strain on the shirt. He thought he should be alarmed, as the round whiteness tumbled in a gleaming spiral through the darkness. But he could not summon anything but joy. At last they ducked under a passing cloud and back toward Earth. Frankie felt his heart falter at the loss of altitude, but it was trees and hills and a country lane rushing up fast, not the gray city streets where cats were never safe. "Not yet. Don't leave me yet," he breathed, as they rushed down towards a pile of hay past the huddle of fleecy backs within a pen. Frankie spread his arms like wings, hoping to stay aloft. The wind rushed up to meet them, a soft barrier. Maurice's purring grew louder like a plane. With the earth skimming pebbly beneath his bare feet, Frankie reached back timidly to stroke Maurice's head. A warm, rough tongue. A mew. A mud puddle. Frankie had forgotten to tuck his legs up under him. His big toe skimmed dark water, and he tumbled in. He cried out as his shoulders ripped free. He rolled with the blow, but it was soft after all. Mud and a brackish pond. He struggled, floated when his feet sank in the mud. It was not so different from flying. He flipped on his back in time to see a cat's silhouette crossing the moon. That soft call might be one of a number of night birds, but he knew that little voice. Farewell. Frankie picked himself up, stroked through the water, climbed up through the softness of the mud, clutching at the stiffness of cattails. He stood alone at the end of a country road, beyond the broken fence, just under the shadow of the dark mass of trees. The farmyard was dark and silent, though the insects were loud here in the night. Overhead, a phalanx of dark shapes passed, cats or silent birds, he couldn't tell. Muddy, unshod, he walked back towards the city, dazed by the beauty of the open night. So quiet, so peaceful, so close to home. Though his feet grew tired, his heart was light. A young man driving home from the night shift took pity and dropped him right at his townhouse door. It seemed, for this night at least, that there was nothing to fear. The next morning, Frankie opened all the windows and left them that way, even when he took his walk. He gazed at the fences and railings and garden plots and thought cheerfully of the way it had all looked from the air. He smiled and said hello to neighbors whose names he'd learned from years of overhearing. He tipped his hat to their sunny smiles, thinking of Maurice. There were no cats visible in the neighborhood now, but he knew they were hidden in the clouds, perching unseen in the trees, free as birds. Sometimes gray fur drifted down to catch in his black hat, or lie still among his silver hair. Frankie ate cat food every morning to give him courage. Each day he felt his feet lift further from the ground.
And welcome back. That was Fine Flying Things by Adele Gardner, narrated by Ellie Hirschman. This is a lovely, bittersweet story about recognizing and accepting changes in life. And of course it has the extra bonus of cats. I think it's a fitting way for me to say goodbye to PodCastle. That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, our audio engineers Devin Martin and Eric Valdes, our forum moderator Osicat, your co-editors Eleanor R. Wood and Shingai Njeri Kagunda, assistant editor Caitlin Zavonovich, host Matt Dovey, as well as all our amazing first readers, Andrew K. Ho, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Korsaini, Ryan Cole, Sarah S. Messenger, Sophie Barker, Sri Kripa Krishna Prasad, Tava Nova, Tierney Bailey, and Zeev Wheaties. Thanks for letting us share another story with you. Be sure to share this episode with your friends, reach out to us on social media, and if you would like to keep up with all of Escape Artists' podcasts, head to patreon.com, EA Podcasts for more. PodCastle will be back next week with another tale. See you then.